Okay, boys and girls, today we're going to talk about retelling a story because sometimes we want to retell a story and we want to retell it in our own words. And there's a certain way to do that to make it easier to retell the story. Because when we retell a story, we don't tell every single thing in the story. We tell it in a way that's easier to retell. We only tell certain parts of it. So here's a way that here's an anchor chart. And our chart is going to help us tell the story, retell the story the best way. So retelling a story helps us understand it better. And here's a tip. We think about who, what, but, and how. And they help us retell the story. And when we think about who, we think about who is the main character in the story. And then we think about what. What does the main character want? Because the main character always wants something in a story. And then we think, but what problem does the main character face? Because the main character always has a problem in a story. And then we think about how is the problem resolved at the end of the story. And we think of all these things, we can easily retell a story. And so what we're doing is we're telling about the important characters, the setting, and then we do the events in order. The beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. We're looking at the conflict and the resolution. That's the beginning, middle, and end. Or really the middle and the end. That's where we have the conflict and the resolution. The beginning of the story always introduces us to the characters of the story, boys and girls. That's where we get introduced to who's in the story, where is it taking place. And we always use the important sequence words. First, next, then, later, and finally. Those words help us order our story. Do you have a question about that? What's your question?
Technically, when you retell a story, usually it's a book report.
No, not just a book report. Sometimes you'll be retelling a story to someone. You might say, oh, I read this great book, and I want to tell you a little about it. You could retell them. Sometimes retelling isn't a book report. You're right. Sometimes it is a book report where you're using your own words. So it can be a book report. It could be a review about a book. It could be you're just telling somebody about it. And it can be because you want to understand what's happening in the story. That's when another time we might be retelling a story. So that's why we need to figure it out. And I have a very short video for you, boys and girls, about retelling. So let's watch our video. I'm going to switch to that right now. How to retell a story.
How to retell a story. Retell means to tell the most important parts of a story from beginning to end. We often retell stories to show that we understood it. Sometimes we retell a story just for fun because we want to tell our friends about it. When you retell a story, you can't retell everything. You only retell the most important parts. So, what is important? Usually the most important parts are the characters, the setting, and the big events that happen in the story. Have you heard the story Goldilocks and the Three Bears? I'm going to retell it to you. Goldilocks and the Three Bears is a story about a girl named Goldilocks who goes for a walk in the forest. In the beginning, the bears left their house to go for a walk while their porridge cooled. Next, Goldilocks came to their house and she ate their porridge, sat in their chairs, and then fell asleep in one of their beds. In the end, the bears came home and scared Goldilocks. She jumped out of bed and ran away. My retelling included the characters, the setting, and the most important events from the beginning, middle, and end. Now you can practice retelling a story on your own. Thanks for watching. Check out other reading videos on the Teaching Without Frills YouTube channel.
Okay, so boys and girls, we learned some important things in that video, didn't we? Now, do we retell every single thing in the story? Do we retell every single event in the story when we retell? Am I going to tell everything that happens? Oh, Olivia? No, I'm not going to tell every single thing that happened. I'm just going to tell the important events in the story. Just the important events. I'm going to tell the characters. I'm going to tell the setting. Those are the things I'm going to tell. I'm going to tell who, what, where, when, why, and how. I want to tell what happens in the beginning. I'm going to tell the middle. And I'm going to tell the ending. I want to tell the problem and how they resolved the problem. Now, we are going to be doing the retell on our story, Dear Primo. That story is very interesting for several reasons. Does anybody know what's so interesting about that story? It's not like the usual stories in our reading book. What's so interesting about that story that makes it a little different? Ava?
They use Spanish words.
They use some Spanish words. That's different than our usual stories. What else is different about it? Lucas?
They're like sending notes to each other in 3 different states.
They're sending letters to each other. One is in the United States, and where's the other cousin?
Mexico.
In Mexico. Mexico isn't a state, it's a country. It's its own country. So they're sending letters to each other. So that is kind of one thing that's making it different. Most of our stories aren't like that. So we're going to be retelling the story. So we have to think about, who are the characters in our story? Who are the characters in our story? What are their names? What are our characters' names? Rose? Do you remember their names? Charlie is one, and who is the other cousin? Do you remember his name? Do you remember his name? Yes?
Primo.
No, Primo means something in Spanish. What does Primo mean in Spanish? Cousin. Primo means is cousin in Spanish. What was the other cousin's name?
It was
Charlie and Carlito. Those are the cousins' names. Okay, so we have our cousins. And what do they do in the story? What is going on in the story? So we know we have the two cousins. One lives in the United States. One lives in Mexico. So there we go. We have our characters. We have the setting of the story right off the bat. So what's going on? What's going on in our story? Tell me, what's happening in our story?
They're sending letters to each other.
They're sending letters. And what are they telling each other in the letters? What are they telling each other in the letters? Ava,
How their life is about.
what's going on in their lives, right? They're telling each other about their lives. Okay? And what do they want to do? What do they want to do? Bianca? They want to see each other. And how is that problem resolved? How's the problem resolved? Bryson, how's their problem resolved?
They meet each other.
They meet each other. Was that very difficult to figure out? So we have the two cousins. One lives in Mexico. One lives in the United States. They write letters to each other about their lives. They tell each other different things about their lives. They want to meet each other, and then they get to meet each other. That kind of sums up our whole story, because they're exchanging facts about each other's lives. Now here's what I want you to do, boys and girls. I want you to go to your page about retell. We need our retell page. Let's look at our retell page. It says retell the story. Now your retell the story, it looks like this. And it says retell the story, and it says first, then, next, and finally. Those are important words when you're retelling a story, right, boys and girls? So you're going to say first, and when you say first, I would need to know who's in the story, wouldn't I? You're going to need to tell me who is in the story. Who's in the story again? Remind me. Who is it? Who's in the story? Who's in the story again? Yes, Charlie and Carlito. And what are they? Yes? They're cousins. And where do they live? Where do those cousins live? Ava?
The United States and Mexico.
In the United States and Mexico. That would be the first thing that you are going to tell me. And then you're going to tell me what they're doing. And then what happens next. And then finally, we know finally what happens. Finally, what happens in this story? What happens finally?
They see each other.
They see each other. So you know the beginning and you know the end, and then you just have to fill in the middle details. Now, when you're going to write this all on your own. This was so easy to write next door. They wrote it in no time at all. Now, of course, your sentences, you're going to read them to make sure that they're good third grade sentences, that they make sense. Oh, wait, hold it up. Your book is probably going to want to be open because you're not going to want to misspell Charlie or Carlito, or if you're going to do Primo. Mexico is in here. United States is in here. There's lots of words in here that you may need. But you're not going to be copying necessarily things directly, like directly quotes from the text, because we don't need that business. But we do need you to be writing what's happening. You're summarizing it. But words that you might need to spell will be in the text. So you can use how to spell things from here. Make sure your sentences make sense. So it's always a good idea to reread what you wrote. Because sometimes what we think we write and what we get down on the paper isn't always the same thing. Because you know how sometimes I'm writing up there and then I double a word or I leave words out because my brain is thinking ahead of my writing. So I want you to double check that. When you're done, I'm going to come check and we'll share them. They turned out so good because you guys are really good at retelling already because you retell things all the time. Yes? Okay, so that is how we retell. We first, then, next, finally. And we think about what our characters are doing. We think about someone. Who was the story about? Wanted. What did the main character want? But what was the problem? So how did the main character try to solve the problem? Then how was the problem resolved?